Hello and welcome to my first ever YouTube tutorial where I'll show you how I made this miniature garden bench using wooden dowels and coffee stirring sticks. This is based on a real reference picture that I have found online, and the first step was dividing all the measurements by 12. Then I drew a life-size sketch marking all the pieces that make up the bench with a letter of the alphabet. And then I made a corresponding list with all the measurements and the numbers of pieces and the type of dowel I used. Then, following this list, I cut out all the pieces. This is a very straightforward and quick process. Just measure, cut, sand, and repeat. When all the pieces are ready, I lay them on another sheet of paper, corresponding letter, so that everything is very tidy and neat, and hopefully I won't lose any piece. And now onto the pieces. I start off with the rear legs, which as you can see are slightly rounded. And the reason why you see 4 pieces on my list, even though of course there are only 2 rear legs, is because I didn't have a dowel which was thick enough to be carved and cut properly, so I glued 2 pieces together, and this way I have a thicker dowel. Then, using the stencil that I sketched in the beginning, I trace out the line on the doubled dowel to get the basic shape of the rear leg, and I do this for both legs, of course. At this point I could have cut out the excess wood with a knife, but I prefer to use an electric file to speed up the process. For this part I'll be using a tip with this rough sandpaper. The process is a bit messy, and of course there's sawdust everywhere flying around, so I didn't film the whole of it, but I hope you get the idea across. So now I have my 2 rear legs, which at the moment are still quite rough around the edges. So I changed my electric file tip and use a finer one to smooth them out. And I could have done this with normal sandpaper, but the electric file is just quicker. And now it's time to make the other 2 slightly curved pieces of the bench, the armrest and the bit that supports the seat, and I use the same process as before. Now that all the pieces are ready, I can stain them, and I use walnut stain, which is simply walnut hull powder mixed with water. And the reason why I'm staining all the pieces now instead of doing it afterwards, after the bench is built, is because I want to handle the bench as little as possible once it's finished. Once the pieces are dry, I lay them out on a piece of paper to make sure that I'm not missing anything. And at this point, I could have simply glued everything together, but for this project I decided to go a step further to make the bench more sturdy and less subject to breaking. So instead of just gluing, I decided to use pegs. So for each joint, I mark out with a pencil this part, and then drill a hole, a tiny hole with my electric file tip on both pieces. And now it's time to make the peg that will join the 2 pieces together. For this I use a simple toothpick, which I reduce in size with my electric file. Then I cut out a tiny section, and I don't bother making it too smooth or precise because you won't be able to see it anyway. The important thing is that it fits. I used this technique for each point of contact, each part where 2 pieces meet, and you can see the final result of one of the 2 sides complete. Now I did use a little bit of glue to secure everything in place, but very, very little. Now onto the bag. Once again I change the tip of my electric file, and I use this one, which is not a blade exactly, but it works as one. And with this, I carve out an indentation along one of the sides of the upper and lower rail. So I do this for both rails. And then I stick all the 12 slats in. As you can see, they stay in even without glue. To make sure that the distance between each slat is the same, I use a piece of paper with squares, and I secure one of the 2 rails in place with tape, and then proceed with sticking in all the slats. And the distance between each slat is 0.5 centimeter. So even if there are tiny differences with the length of each slat, which can sometimes happen, of course, even though we try to measure as precisely as possible, it happens. This way you won't see any gaps. And now that I have the 2 sides and the back, I can assemble them together. Again, I use the peg system, and this bit was kind of hard to film because my hands were in front of the camera, kind of hiding what I was doing, but I hope that you can understand it. And now it's time to cut the 5 slats that make up the seat. These were not cut to measure in the beginning, so I'm doing it now. I use the first one as a reference. I put it in place without gluing it, of course, and with a pencil I mark out the point where I have to cut it. And then I use this one as a reference to cut out the other four slats. And then I glue them in place, and there are no pegs for these. And this is the finished bench, which is still quite fragile, but not as fragile as it would have been had I only used glue to build it. Actually, it's not finished yet. There are still the 2 side decorations to make. Very simply, it's just a tiny piece of coffee stir stick, carved and cut to measure, and then glued in place. And so this is the finished bench, but surprise, I have made 2 of them, because the first one was just a test to see if the thing with pegs worked, and it did work. So I decided to go with a twin set, which will outflank the entrance to my miniature greenhouse, which at the moment is just work in progress, but one day it will hopefully look something like this. Thank you so much for watching my first ever YouTube tutorial. I hope you liked it, and hopefully I'll see you soon with another one. Bye bye.